People have reported giant mummies buried under these mountains. A hum that rises out of solid ground with no earthquake to explain it. And a stretch of border where armed guards will turn you around before you've even seen what you weren't supposed to see. 3 completely different claims from 3 completely different decades. Most people stop there. That's the story. We're not going to stop there. Whatever actually happened here, it happened in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. Death Valley doesn't just test equipment, it tests perception. Heat bends light until distance stops meaning anything. Silence grows so complete that your own heartbeat starts to feel like an intrusion. And that's exactly why stories like these have survived here longer than almost anywhere else on the continent. A landscape harsh enough that the ordinary explanation always feels a little too small for it. For over a century, 3 separate stories have attached themselves to this basin, each one starting from a real observation and ending somewhere far stranger. That somewhere beneath the Panamint Mountains, a lost underground city holds the remains of an 8-foot-tall people no history book has ever named. That a sound rising out of the salt flats proves the desert is hollow underneath, riddled with chambers nobody has ever mapped. And that the fences along its eastern edge aren't protecting wilderness at all, but something the government would rather you didn't ask about. 3 stories, 3 different eras of American anxiety, all pointing at the same stretch of sand. Tonight, we're not asking whether Death Valley feels strange. It does. Almost nowhere else on the continent will make you feel this small, this fast. We're asking a colder question, not what people believe is buried or humming or hidden here, but how 3 completely unrelated pieces of American history got folded into one single tidy legend. And we're going to trace it, layer by layer, using publicly available records, geological evidence, and documented historical sources. 3 separate paper trails, 3 separate decades of American history, never meant to touch each other until the human mind welded them into a single myth. The data is already public. The archives are already searchable. By the end of this film, one of these stories will completely fall apart. The surprising part is which one survives the longest. We begin in the summer of 1947. On August the 4th, newspapers across Southern California ran a story that read less like journalism and more like pulp fiction, except it was printed as fact on an actual front page under an actual byline. A retired physician named Dr. F. Bruce Russell, working alongside a Cincinnati businessman named Howard E. Hill, announced that they'd found a vast network of connected caverns deep inside the Panamint Mountains on the western edge of Death Valley. According to Russell, he'd stumbled onto the shaft by accident back in 1931 while working a mining claim. What he described finding 16 years later was extraordinary by any measure. 32 interconnected catacombs, spanning what he claimed was hundreds of square miles underground. Inside, he said, were the mummified remains of men over 8 feet tall, dressed in a woven metallic fabric no one could identify, surrounded by stone altars and statues that echoed, oddly, both ancient Egyptian and East Asian design, a mixture no single ancient culture would have produced, which should have been the first clue. Something didn't add up. Hill called it the amazing museum. Proof, he said, of a lost civilization that lived here back when Death Valley was still an inland sea, long before the desert basin we know today ever existed. The timing could not have been better for the story. This was the era of King Tut mania, still lingering from 2 decades earlier. An American public hungry for lost civilizations, and a newspaper business that knew exactly how to feed that hunger. Competing wire services in Los Angeles and San Diego, each looking for the one headline that would outsell the paper next door. And then, just as investors started asking to see the site for themselves, Russell and Hill simply vanished from the public record, along with any trace of the corporation they'd promised to form to fund the excavation. No lawsuit followed them. No creditor ever tracked them down. They didn't get chased out of town, they just stopped being interesting once the money stopped showing up. To alternative researchers, that disappearance wasn't a red flag. It was the whole point, proof, they'd later argue, that someone bigger had stepped in, sealed the shaft, and quietly erased the evidence to protect the official version of history. At first glance, this almost sounds impossible to debunk. If the cave really was sealed, or quietly bought out and buried by some larger institution, what would investigators even expect to find? A conveniently empty mountain looks exactly like a cover-up, and exactly like nothing ever having been there at all. But that's not actually how archaeology or fraud tends to work. So let's start with the simplest question. If Russell really discovered one of the greatest archaeological finds in American history, what did he actually leave behind? 16 years is a long time to sit on a secret that big without a single scrap of proof surfacing. The first surprise wasn't what investigators found. It was what they couldn't find. No readily verifiable medical license. That doesn't prove Russell wasn't a physician. It means researchers have not been able to independently verify his claimed medical credentials through readily accessible surviving public records. No verified mining claim tied directly to Russell either. Not in the 1930s, not anywhere in the Panamint Range, though records from this period are fragmented enough. That absence alone isn't proof of nothing. So people went looking. Reporters, independent prospectors, some of them within days of the story running. Nothing. Within weeks, reporters, prospectors, and curiosity seekers attempted to locate the site. None produced verifiable evidence that the cave existed. Not one shaft, not one tailing pile, not one. Whatever Russell actually found on that mountain in 1931, it almost certainly looked exactly like this. Ordinary, forgettable. Nothing that needed 32 catacombs to explain it. Imagine trying to build a subway system inside a pile of shattered dinner plates. That's essentially the engineering problem here. The Panamints are intensely faulted, brittle limestone, fractured, folded, and stressed by millions of years of tectonic movement. Small caves? Absolutely, they exist. Solution cavities, old mine workings, fractured pockets. The range has plenty of those. But no published geological survey has ever identified anything remotely approaching the scale Russell described. 32 interconnected catacombs, spanning hundreds of square miles, in rock this unstable. It isn't that caves are impossible here. It's that a system this size, this connected, would leave a geological footprint nobody has ever found. Contemporary reports describe Hill as a Cincinnati businessman, and later researchers have pointed to how closely the story resembles land promotion schemes common during the era. A good story raising investment money faster than a good mine ever could. The underground city wasn't an archaeological claim so much as a sales pitch, dressed up in exactly the imagery an Egypt-obsessed public was primed to believe. When investors eventually asked for proof, they could see with their own eyes the story quietly folded, and Russell and Hill folded with it, leaving behind nothing but a newspaper clipping that later generations would mistake for an official record, which still leaves one honest question standing. If the giants were never real, why did this particular legend outlive nearly every other mining scam from the same decade? None of this happened in a vacuum either. 1947 was the same year Roswell became a national story. The same year flying saucer sightings started flooding newspaper desks across the country. And the same year, America's earliest Cold War secrecy culture was starting to take root. Treasure hunting booms and pseudo-scientific archaeology were already common currency. A story like Russell and Hill's wasn't swimming against the current of 1947. It was swimming with it. By every physical measure, the underground city disappears. No physician, no claim, no cave. But something else survives. Because long before newspapers ever printed a word about giant mummies, prospectors were already hearing something rising up through the ground itself with no earthquake and no explanation anywhere in sight. Beyond the myth of the lost city is something people have actually experienced, generation after generation, and can't simply explain away as a hoax. Travelers standing on the Eureka Dunes or out on the endless salt pan at Badwater describe a low, booming hum, rising straight up through the ground with no earthquake and often no wind at all, a sound some compare to a distant kettle drum, others to a jet passing far overhead, and almost all of them describe feeling it through their feet before they ever consciously register hearing it. It's not a story passed down secondhand. People have recorded it, dated it, and still argue about what it actually is. That sound gave rise to a theory that's persisted for generations, that beneath the crust of these dry salt lakes sit massive, hollow chambers, air pockets the size of buildings, sealed underground with the desert surface acting like the skin of a drum, stretched tight over the top of them, and every temperature swing, striking that drum just hard enough to make it ring. It's a good theory. It just isn't the right one. The sound isn't coming from beneath the dune. It's coming from the dune itself. Millions of grains sliding down that slope begin moving together. Think of an orchestra that suddenly finds perfect rhythm, except the instrument here is sand, and gravity is the one holding the baton. Researchers at Caltech and France's CNRS have studied booming dunes like this one directly, measuring the phenomenon at over 100 decibels under ideal avalanche conditions, loud enough to feel in your chest with no hollow chamber underneath it anywhere. Every prospector who ever sat by a campfire and heard that sound was hearing something real. They just didn't have a word yet for friction acting like music. As for the claim that the salt flats themselves are hollow, deep core drilling and seismic surveying by the USGS tell a very different story. And it's worth being clear here. Not every mysterious sound reported in Death Valley has one explanation. Several distinct mechanisms likely account for different reports, and the booms out on the open salt pan aren't the singing dunes at all. Death Valley is a closed basin, and closed basins fill up. 10,000 feet of dense, waterlogged sediment, gravel, and salt. No air gap. If anything, it's the opposite of hollow. So where's the boom coming from? One well-supported explanation for many of these reports is thermal fracturing of the salt crust, surface salt cracking, as it swings from 120 degrees to near freezing after dark. The same reason a hot glass cracks under cold water, just played out across miles of open ground instead of a single cup. If you're enjoying investigations, that separate folklore from evidence, consider subscribing. And I'm curious, which explanation has surprised you more so far? The singing dunes or the cracking salt? Because the physics can explain the sand. It can explain the salt. But past the dunes, there's a stretch of border where the explanations stop being geological and start being classified. This is where the story changes. Because unlike the first two mysteries, this one begins with something that's undeniably real. Lights in the night sky, armed patrols, a stretch of the eastern border where some of the most tightly guarded airspace on the planet begins. The Nevada National Security Site, the Nellis Complex, restricted skies over the Funeral and Amargosa ranges. For decades, hikers along that boundary have reported strange lights, unfamiliar high-altitude aircraft, moving in ways commercial planes don't, and sudden run-ins with armed personnel enforcing lines that aren't always clearly marked on any public map. Out of those encounters grew a theory that the park's 1994 expansion wasn't really about protecting desert wildlife, but about quietly widening a buffer zone around underground military tunnels, supposedly connecting secret test facilities to hidden bases beneath the Panamint Range, a theory that borrows, more than a little, from the same underground highway imagery Russell and Hill had already planted in this exact same desert 47 years earlier. The lights are real, the fences are real, the armed patrols are real. And if you'd stood at this fence line back in 1962, you would have had absolutely no way of knowing which rumors were ridiculous and which were simply classified. The only real question left is what all of it was actually built to protect. Here's where the story starts falling apart, because much of what was once classified here has since been declassified. It just never got explained to anyone who was standing on the wrong side of the fence at the time. Beginning in 1951, the federal government set aside 1,350 square miles of desert directly beside Death Valley as the Nevada Proving Grounds. More than 900 announced nuclear tests and related detonations. Over 4 decades, the exact count depends on how joint detonations and safety experiments get tallied. But the scale isn't in dispute. Some of the resulting craters are still visible from a commercial airliner window today. The airspace overhead became the testing ground for nearly every generation of American stealth aircraft that followed. None of it made the news at the time. That was the entire point. Whole aircraft programs existed for years before the public ever learned their names. He never got an explanation. For 40 years, almost nobody did. That silence is where most of this theory was actually born. But silence isn't the same thing as a secret tunnel. It's just silence. And silence is exactly the kind of gap a good story is happy to fill. The lights, the maneuvers, the sonic booms, they weren't alien aircraft, and they weren't evidence of tunnels running underneath the park. They were the physical signature of real aerospace testing, conducted in genuine secrecy for genuinely defensible Cold War reasons, at a time when the entire premise of the program depended on nobody outside a small circle of engineers, knowing what was actually flying overhead. And the 1994 expansion of Death Valley into a national park was a separate piece of legislation entirely, driven by land conservation and watershed protection. Decades after most of that classified activity had already been running next door, and championed by conservationists who had no more access to the military's classified programs than the hikers filing UFO reports did. The public legislative history overwhelmingly attributes the expansion to conservation policy, not military planning. Two boundary lines drawn for two completely different reasons, sitting close enough on a map that it was almost inevitable someone would eventually draw a third line connecting them that was never actually there. Does knowing the cold historical reality make any of this any less haunting? I don't think it does. Those coordinates haven't changed since the moment this film opened. Only the stories we've attached to them have. When we trace the fraudulent land scheme of 1947, the physics of sand grains bouncing in unison, and the declassified Cold War flight logs next door, the dark theories of Death Valley dissolve into something quieter and, in its own way, more human than any of them, because every one of these stories started with something a real person actually saw or heard or found, standing exactly where you'd be standing. People didn't invent giant mummies, hollow deserts, and underground highways because the evidence pointed there. They invented them because standing at the bottom of the hottest, driest, most indifferent basin on the continent is genuinely hard to sit with. And a story, even a false one, is easier to carry than the raw, silent scale of geological time. The evidence for these extraordinary claims never materialized. 3 separate threads, 3 separate decades, and in every case, the honest explanation turned out to be almost as strange as the myth it replaced. A promoter scheme that outlived its own promoters, a sound made of nothing but falling sand, and a border drawn twice, for 2 reasons, by 2 generations who never once needed to talk to each other. None of it required a conspiracy. It only required time, and a landscape big enough to hold whatever people needed it to mean. The myths will keep coming. So will the evidence. The only real question is knowing which one you're standing on.